My name is Darren Thomas and I'm the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this video, we're going to take a look at different types of writing that can be used in the ESL context. Now, before I go any further, these tools are not limited to ESL, but they're kind of derived from that context. And for people who are not teaching ESL, you can also use these skills to teach your own students writing. Now, basically, there are 4 levels of writing that are commonly used in the context of ESL, going from the most simplest or easiest, which is called imitative, down to extensive. In between these two extremes of imitative and extensive, we have intensive and responsive. So we're going to take a look at each of these, and then I'll talk briefly about, giving you some tips on how to approach marking when dealing with these different levels of writing. So, imitative, as you can see here, is focused on grammar and on reproducing whatever text that they're looking at. For example, here's an example here. You might have the students copy the sentence, "The dog lives at home." Here, all the student does is basically just copy the sentence word for word. There's not a whole lot of deep thought. You're just trying to expose them to the language. And again, this is also a technique that is commonly used for teaching children how to write. You just want them to get used to the neural motor connection that they need to form the letters. Not very deep, not very complicated. And the typical ESL student will not spend a large amount of time at this particular level. The next level that we have, the next step up, if you will, in terms of complexity, is called intensive. Here, you have to do with the word choice that is appropriate for the context. If you're familiar with ideas related to social linguistics and language acquisition, there's a thing called pragmatics where certain words are appropriate for certain contexts. So, if you look at the example here, the directions are simple. Put the sentence in the past tense. And so the sentence is, Dan is going to the store. That's obviously in present tense. And so the student would have to, not only are we assuming that the student can write the letters, which is at the imitative level, but here we are looking at the student's ability to take this sentence that's in present tense, if you will, and to transform it to another style, another tense of writing, which requires knowledge of vocabulary and knowledge of grammar and other tools that demonstrate a certain mastery of writing. Now, at the next level, this is the second to highest level, is what we call responsive. This is where the student goes from writing isolated sentences, which is what we found at the imitative and the responsive level, to now writing in paragraphs. So again, this is where we get to the point where the student is really beginning to mature as a writer, the ESL student or even a child. And so an example of how you might use responsive is, you show the student a picture of a graph, if you will, or some sort of a chart, and the student has to take what they see visually and put it into words in a paragraph in which they describe the picture. Again, this would obviously take several sentences and shows a much deeper mastery of knowledge of writing. They have to be aware of the context, the grammar. They have to be aware of how to describe what they're seeing. It involves multiple skills, and it really begins to show an in-depth knowledge of the language. Last but not least, we have what we call extensive writing. This is basically where you take the concepts that are found in the previous 3 levels, responsive, intensive, and imitative, and you apply them over an entire essay or a research paper. So by the time a student gets to this point, they're probably going more in an academic direction in terms of their language skills. So a student can, share a purpose, objectives, provide the main ideas and conclusions to a coherent paper, which is very difficult for an ESL student because many people struggle to do these particular things in their own mother tongue. And so to be able to do this in another context where you're using a second language shows a very strong in-depth mastery of the language. Again, we're assuming that grammar and other things are at an adequate level. So these are the 4 levels. Now, just to give you a brief comment on how to mark these papers, as you go higher up in terms of the level of writing that the student is at, going from imitative to intensive to responsive to extensive, the papers are going to require much more subjectivity in terms of how to mark and grade them. Therefore, we just want to encourage the use of rubrics, especially as you get to the higher levels. Imitative is very easy to correct. It's right or wrong. If you don't copy the sentence correctly, the answer is right there in front of the student. But when you start getting to the point where you're looking at, research papers and objectives and purposes, it gets to the point to where it's not exactly how you say it, but whether or not the various components are there that really begins to take much more importance in my own experience. So In this particular video, we looked at different types of writing and the 4 levels that are commonly used in the context of ESL, beginning with imitative, moving to intensive, responsive, and lastly extensive. We also talked briefly about some concerns about marking. As you go to the higher levels, it becomes much more subjective in terms of trying to identify what is considered quality, and so we want to try to recommend that you use rubrics or some other guidepost that communicates clearly the expectations that you have for the students. So we want to thank you for watching. My name is Darren Thomas, and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. Take care.